The ABC's Deputy Foreign Editor and former Middle East correspondent Matt Brown joins us now. Matt, g'day. Yeah, so what did you make of the situation this morning where we got this information from the Israeli Defence Forces a couple of hours ago that their air and ground troops were involved, and then there's been a bit of a clarification in the last hour or so?
Yeah, so at the micro level, bad messaging from the Israeli military, and I'll go into the macro level why it is so important. They did tweet that air and ground troops are attacking. Our correspondent in Israel, Tom Joyner, along with many others, rang them and said, what does this mean? Nothing more except what's said there. So people took it to quite literally. Now, in the last hour or so, we've been hearing more reports out of Israeli media who are calling their sources in the military. What does it mean that ground troops are attacking in the Gaza Strip? It seems that the artillery we have seen building up around the edge of the Gaza Strip is being used and used forcefully.
But had that been the case previously, we'd heard that there were airstrikes and that was the predominant information, but were there artillery strikes from some Israeli positions before now?
Literally without standing there, as I've been able to do in the past, I don't know. It is normal. Often they use artillery to fire into the farmland, which is all the way along that border region, to keep militants out who might want to come and launch short-range rockets just across the border at the towns. So that is something that happens. We definitely are seeing now that it is happening. Another thing that happens when they talk about ground forces attacking, Joe, is that small units will cross the border. They will go in, they will look for houses, they'll look for tunnels, they'll look for these smaller locations that are close to the border. So you can think of it, I guess, as a bit of a special forces operation. So that would also be true. But it left a misleading impression that there was a large-scale ground invasion about to begin.
But based on Netanyahu's statement in the following hour, he was reinforcing the fact that this is going to be continuing for quite some time.
Correct. And this past hour just shows you how much on a knife edge this situation is. The Israeli military has cancelled leave for active duty soldiers, called up thousands of reservists. So they are building a force there. Why does that matter? Because when ground troops go in, whilst the bombing is very destructive, when ground troops go in, that opens up a whole nother range of possibilities, a lot more risk to them and a lot more death and destruction on the ground, basically wherever they go.
And you were talking about the macro level implications of what this tweet was. What are they? Well,
so starting with that, a lot more lives at risk when ground forces are crossing into the Gaza Strip. If they do it, they often do it in a pretty major way. They'll go into that border area, but then they can go in and cut the strip into 3 separate sections even, if they go all the way. That makes it very difficult then for the international peace mediation efforts to succeed, because you've committed a large force and you've got to then get them out safely as well. So everyone's on a knife edge about that very issue of how poised they are to go in and what they would do when they go in.
And it's always an incredibly fraught situation, this relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis. How has it come to this flashpoint that we're at now?
How far back do we go? Yeah. But, I mean, the proximate cause has been tension in Jerusalem, tension around Ramadan, about the policing of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, about a court case about evicting Palestinians from a house in East Jerusalem. Hamas that runs the Gaza Strip, and previously has waged terror campaigns in Israel and elsewhere. And it also seems to be, repositioning itself. Mahmoud Abbas, the more moderate Palestinian leader who runs the West Bank, had talked about elections a month or so ago. So there's also a sense there that Hamas is essentially signalling it's still here and prosecuting its agenda. It said that Israeli police have to get out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound at the start of all of this, and they didn't. There were riots going on there. But it's used that as, a pretext or the reason to say that it's taking this action of firing rockets into Israel in the first place.
And so we're seeing some of these pictures now. I think of these really ugly incidents of some the Arab and Jew clashes within Israel. Take us through what's happened there, the intensity of those and the depth of concern within the administration about the possibility of those getting out of hand.
Yeah, this is really worrying. You know, you've had a long period in Israel where the harder right wing of Israeli politics has been dominant. There's less and less talk of a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians getting a state. So the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Arab Israelis as they're often called,
which make up about what percentage of the population?
Hard
to know, right?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but a substantial proportion. You know, they see that whole agenda stagnating, in fact getting worse. But there have also been statements from Hamas, for example, talking about them being sort of a part of this conflict. Israelis, some of them, more extremists, depicting them as a bit of a fifth column. And I think more than previous conflicts, you are seeing now incidents where there are attempted lynchings, you know, where some Palestinians in East Jerusalem would try and grab an Israeli Jewish guy out of a car, where the same thing would happen down near the coast near Tel Aviv. Israeli Jewish residents think that that guy's an Arab and they're getting him. So there's been really serious incidents of communal violence.
And so how tough does life continue to be for people living in Gaza and people over the border in Israel who are under constant concern about the possibility of rocket attacks? And to what extent has Benjamin Netanyahu been pushing the envelope with settlements?
Yeah, well, the settlements continue to grow in the West Bank despite UN Security Council resolutions in the past against them. And he also talked in the run-up to the last election about formally annexing much of the West Bank, which is a very controversial move because it has big implications for that peace process. But, I mean, I think for the people of Gaza, you know, except for a very short border with Egypt, which is used to let people go out to medical treatment, go on the Hajj, for example, all of the formal crossings for goods, fuel, they all come through Israel and they're controlled by Israel on the Israeli side. So Israel controls the air and sea space around Gaza. So they have lived for many years now under that seal. And that's tough, long-term, difficult. Now they are dealing with Hamas firing rockets from the middle of population centres as well as from sort of the more outlying areas. They're dealing with these Israeli airstrikes coming in. They might be laser-guided bombs on an apartment building, but they obviously cause other damage, civilian casualties. I think the last count for children was 29 children in Gaza dead. In Israel, certainly I think it was 5 civilians, 2 children in Israel. And so Israelis live with this fear of the rockets coming out, and they're quite sophisticated these days, and as we've seen, long range, but they're not guided missiles. You know, they're not hitting a house. They're being fired at population centres, and everyone is living in fear of where they're going to land.
Has there been some surprise at Hamas's stockpile of these weapons this time around? Because what was it the general thought that Israel had previously been able to restrict supply of the elements needed to get access to these rockets? Yeah.
I mean, when I started reporting there in 2005, the rockets were kind of this big. You know, now they're metres long and fly 70 kilometres sometimes. In the last major conflict in 2014, Hamas used an awful number of them. And since then, the military-backed government has taken power in Egypt. So that little border that I mentioned has really been quite well sealed. So the smuggling of weapons that used to go in, we can assume has largely been stopped. But they make them, and they've gotten very good at making them. So I am surprised myself that they've been able to fire that many. If they're able to keep it up, that will be a real surprise.
And as someone who has spent time there, both in Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank, what's your summation of the situation there overall now, and the prospects for what will happen there over the coming years?
Oh God, over the coming years. It's not looking good. I mean, all of the dynamics that I just mentioned, the nature of politics in Israel, the nature of politics in the Palestinian territories, the division there between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, that's all on a downward trajectory for any sort of an agreement that would satisfy people. In the near term, we've also seen a bit of a repeat of these previous conflicts. The Egyptians are meeting with Hamas. Joe Biden's been talking to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, but the Americans have said at the Security Council, let's not issue a statement just yet, let's let these background attempts to bring an end to the conflict play out a bit longer. And of course, during that time, the combatants are firing and killing more people on either side of the line. So it's a depressingly familiar scene. One thing I haven't been able to check perfectly, but I have the impression that the number of dead has been rising quite quickly compared to previous conflicts. So there's a lot of firepower in densely populated places, and that's a real worry.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak, but thanks for your perspective. Okay, Matt, around there.